Okay, we ready to go? Y'all ready to start the clock? Awesome. Okay, you guys should go to your notes. Colonial Life. Sounds like an insurance company. But it's not. It's life in colonial America. So we're going to be talking about life in colonial America today. This is your typical, without filter reminder, your typical yeoman farm in colonial America. A lot of livestock, various subsistence farming crops. Maybe you grow a little tobacco if you can, but most farmers were not living on large plantations. They were living on small farms, and like 75% of farmers were yeomen, like growing their own crops to feed the family and maybe sell and trade in the community. And then like 90% of the society was rural in colonial America. Really looking at 4 major urban centers: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charlestown, which is now Charleston. Even back at this period of time, I may have already mentioned this, Norfolk, Richmond, Williamsburg, they were just very tiny towns surrounding rural areas. They don't become larger until after the Revolutionary era. All right, so farm work was very difficult in the colonial period. It's still hard work today. Anybody do any farm work in this room? Grew up doing any farm work? It's no joke. So this is early to rise, going to bed at dusk. There was not a great deal to do in the evenings. Some families did play games and sit around and knit quilts and read the Bible. That was the extent of the entertainment, or read other books. Most of the education was done at home. Most of the clothing that people had in rural areas and on farms was made piecemeal by the hearth. So, a lot was done by the fire. They would typically say, is it worth a candle? Anybody ever made a candle in here? It's tough work, right? It takes time. So people were very sort of frugal when it came to burning up their candles in the evenings. So a lot of folks immigrating over, but remember that the overwhelming majority of those living in colonial America are English. We'll talk more about the Scots, Irish, German immigrants that have come in, or that will come in. We have already talked a bit about the Dutch and the Swedes and the Finns, but those numbers are pretty small. I have a pretty solid map breakdown that shows you these different groups. The American wilderness was very harsh, as was the as was disease. So malaria, dysentery, typhoid killed a lot of settlers. Yellow fever, scarlet fever. But the life expectancy in colonial America was much better than that of England and other parts of Europe. Men far outweighed, the male population far outweighed that of the female population, about a 6-to-1 male to female ratio. Men most certainly fought over women. Somebody brought up the pistol duels and other duels that were fought, if they were fought over women, and yes. But we're also going to look at this ratio as an issue related to the causes of the American Revolution as well when we move forward. All of these economic institutions, bless you, shipbuilding, fishing, lumbering, cutting down trees, farming, whether it be grain or livestock or tobacco or indigo or rice, all of it depends on climate, soil conditions, availability of natural resources. The bottom line here is that Jared Diamond geography theory, that is at play here. So when we first talked about Jared Diamond and we looked at the case study of the Incan being conquered by Pizarro, I said, look, this geography theory is going to remain a theme moving forward. And here we are again talking about geography theory in colonial America and how these economic institutions, political institutions are established as a result of the geography. There's a strong belief in private ownership, not only in land, but obviously also in human trafficking. We've talked about chattel slavery. Please keep in mind that slavery will exist in all of the colonies, more so in the colonial South, but even in the Middle Atlantic and New England, slavery existed throughout.
All right, let me close this out real quick. Synergy messing with me.
Okay, so little like a typical view of colonial living. We've got this guy heading off to feed the cattle. Let's call him John, since everybody's name seemed to be John at this period of time. We've got the ladies here working on candles. There's a lot of other interesting things like the free range roaming chickens. Anybody have one of those ladder back chairs in their house? I bet you do, because that's sort of like remained in our, especially this region. We've kept those ladder back chairs. That's a chair that was produced during the colonial period. Nightmare when you have a toddler. Just a heads up. They like to climb them and they flip pretty easily. So just user beware. Hanging the candles there, and then everything was typically made on the farm by these folks or on their private property. Let's talk a little bit about Southern society. We talked earlier about the first families of Virginia, the FFVs. The social pyramid is there's a massive gulf between the haves and the have-nots. The aristocratic nobility that would have received land grants from Charles I or Charles II or James II, obviously Charles II and James II following the Restoration, or even under William and Mary. People still receive land grants. Most of the Cavalier land grants came in those kings, under the house, in the House of Stuart. They are going to be the people that establish the House of Burgesses. Many of them will be knights, like you've heard of one of these famous knights, Sir Thomas Dale. You've all heard of him, right? He was a colonial governor. He had received a large tract. And plantations are going to be developed on these large tracts. And the House of Burgesses are going to set, rules for involvement in politics, whether it be running for office or voting. You have to be white, you have to be male, you have to be 21 or over, and you have to own lands. Here are just some of the notable FFVs, First Families of Virginia: the Custis's, the Jeffersons, the Randolphs, the Lees, the Washingtons, and a lot of them are going to intermarry, sort of like they did in Europe. And that intermarriage, again, I'm not trying to be, it's not like you didn't have brothers and sisters marrying. That wasn't going on, okay? But you did have some first, second, and third cousins marrying to keep this sort of dynastic system going. So all of these families become intertwined. The Custises and the Lees and the Washingtons are all intermarried. The Jeffersons and the Randolphs are intermarried. And some of those families are also ultimately connected, and that keeps these families in control of not only the land, but also the affairs in the House of Burgesses. This also brings up another point. These names are also connected with those aristocratic members of the House of Burgesses that said, hey, you know what? We've had enough of Lord Dunmore, and we've had enough of the tyranny of George III. We're smart enough, and we are capable enough of running our own government and gaining our own independence. So Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Patrick Henry, those are some FFDs that are going to lead the revolutionary movement. Appalachian Society, Piedmont Society. This is where more like beyond the Piedmont, as you like think about crossing Afton Mountain and you get down into the Valley of Virginia. How many people have traveled up and down 81 before? Probably a lot of us, maybe going toward Roanoke or Blacksburg, or north toward Harrisonburg and Winchester. The Shenandoah Valley is an area made up of a lot of farms, right? You see a lot of cattle out there. You see a lot of different style barns. Those are lasting legacies from the colonial period, because a lot of folks are going to go out into that territory and settle, like some of the indentured servants that gained their independence. Not all of them gained their independence. Some of them are runaways. You also have free African Americans moving into that territory. You have Scots-Irish. You have Germans. That's actually where my family settled. They came over. My family is mostly German that came over in the colonial period, and they settled in the Shenandoah Valley and in the Appalachian foothills of the Allegheny Mountains. I was born and raised in that region, and those traditions still are continue on. I'd love nothing more than to take you guys to the Frontier History Museum. Has anybody ever been to it in Stanton, Virginia? It's pretty cool little museum. It's like a living museum, and it's like really hands-on. So you can go in there and learn how to do like blacksmith work, or learn how to blow glass, or make candles. You can do a lot of that different kind of stuff there. Very few cities will sprout up in the American South in the colonial era. Most of them are coastal due to trade. Richmond is on the map, but barely on the map at this time. All right, Richmond, Virginia is going to be established by William Byrd in honor of Richmond, England. But what really puts Richmond on the map is going to be the start of the Revolutionary era. And I'll talk a little bit about the meeting of the Second Virginia Convention later down the road when we talk about Patrick Henry's Liberty or Death speech. Williamsburg, the capital, is moved from Jamestown to Williamsburg because there's a rebellion that we're going to learn about here momentarily that burnt Jamestown to the ground, Bacon's Rebellion. Capital moves to Williamsburg, and the first Southern colonial college is established, second colonial college in the Americas, and that is the College of William and Mary. William and Mary is established at just around the time of the Restoration. I'm sorry, not the Restoration, Glorious Revolution. And it is established to educate Anglican clergy. This becomes a place where the FFEs attend. Jefferson will attend. He's going to be one of the notable graduates. John Marshall, the Randolph family. We'll look at a laundry list of people who are going to shape Virginia politics moving forward that attended William and Mary, and they actually studied law under a very brilliant law professor, the most brilliant law professor in the Americas. Has anybody heard of a guy by the name of George Wythe before? Probably heard the name, but you probably don't know who he is. He is the law professor that taught the Founding Fathers in the South law. Do you have a question, John? Oh, okay. Did anybody have a question? Oh, I saw a hand up. All right. College of William and Mary. Do y'all remember what type of architecture this is? We talked about. Let somebody. Yeah, very good. Nice work, Josh. That's Georgian style architecture. The South is going to be based on cash crops. It's a cash crop economy. They are going to make a fortune off of rice, indigo, and tobacco. Cotton is not yet on the scene. In fact, cotton in this period of time is really only being grown in the private gardens of slaves and indentured servants, mostly slaves. I don't know if you realize this, but a lot of slaves had their own gardens. They did their own subsistence farming on plantations. So we're a little ways away from cotton becoming a king crop. At this period of time, tobacco is the major crop. If you look at by 1700, 40 million pounds of tobacco is coming out of the Chesapeake Bay colonies a year. So we're talking Delaware, Maryland, mostly Virginia, and North Carolina is where your tobacco is coming out of. This Chesapeake tobacco system allows for an aristocratic system to increase. I want to talk about a system that also helped the aristocratic FFDs get a leg up as well, and that system is called the headright system. Has anybody ever heard the headright system? You haven't heard of this system, but you know how it operates. Basically, the headright system said a person could buy a tract of land with the promise of cultivating the land and putting indentured servants on that land with a promise to free those indentured servants and giving them an opportunity to own their own land. The problem was they got large tracts of land, but some of their indentured servants, or most of their indentured servants, never saw the end of their contracts and became tied to the land. What does that sound like? Sounds like slavery, but I'm looking for a different word that you learned about last year. Feudalism, very good. Sounds like feudalism. It's kind of like feudal serfdom, okay, that was happening in colonial Virginia. They get away from the headright system. We're actually going to learn about in a minute why they're going to move away from indentured servitude altogether. Remember, indentured servants could typically be owned for anywhere from 3 to 7 plus years. Depends on what they're there for and what their education is, okay? Obviously, conditions were very brutal. A lot of indentures run away, as do African American and African slaves, and even some African indentures run away. Many of them are going to go west. Has anybody ever heard of the Appalachian people called the Melanesian people before? They're a mixed race group of people. Well, they're actually descendants of basically runaway indentured servants, runaway slaves, and Native American tribes that live together in Appalachia. We'll talk more about them as we move forward. But it's a group of people that it's a race of, well, technically not a race of people. It is a ethnic group of people that are basically an intermingling melting pot group that came about as a result of the colonial period. So let's take a look at this primary document. Did we already go through the process of me being an indentured servant?
Yes.
Yeah? No?
Yes.
Maybe? Where I sold myself into indentured servitude? Okay, so like this right here is an advertisement that says, and I'm going to read it for you because the F's, or the S's, sorry. The S's look like F's, okay? And the F's look like F's. I feel like I'm really walking here. Salisbury's tastes like Salisbury. Okay, so, horrible joke. Moving right along. Wanted to go to Virginia under indentures for a few years, a young man who understands Latin, Greek, and mathematics to serve as a tutor in a gentleman's family, a lad who has served an apprenticeship as a surgeon to live with one of his own profession, 2 gardeners who understand their business well, particularly the work in a garden. These, properly recommended, will meet with suitable encouragement on applying to Buchanan and Simpson, merchants in Glasgow. Where is Glasgow? Scotland. Thank you. Glasgow, Scotland. And they are going to be brought to Virginia. What do you think these contracts would have looked like? Josh? Okay. All right, so their contracts may have been complicated. Why might the tutor or the surgeon's contract be shorter, like years-wise. They're at a very high premium. They might already have some money in their possession, right? They're also educated, so it might be very difficult for them to actually break their contract. Might be a little different, more, I don't know. It depends on the level of education of these gardeners, you know? It would be really, I think it would be very interesting to be able to find the other half of this primary document to find out who these people, did these people answer they had, who were they, and what do their contracts look like. So that would be some cool digging historically to do for the indentured servitude in colonial America. All right, let's talk a little bit about Bacon's Rebellion, okay? As Mason said before, it sounds delicious, but it was actually a very pivotal event. It's not a very difficult one to forget because it is exactly 100 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And it is an early example of colonists wanting independence. Nathaniel Bacon, relative of Sir Francis Bacon, you're familiar with Francis Bacon, philosopher, yeah? Okay, Nathaniel Bacon led a group of indentured servants, former indentured servants rather, and lower class whites to march on Jamestown, burn Jamestown to the ground, and arrest Sir William Berkeley. They did burn Jamestown to the ground. Berkeley was not arrested, and Bacon died of dysentery during the rebellion. They were resentful toward Berkeley's friendly policies toward the Susquehanna Native Americans, also known as the Conestoga, which we'll talk about them later. The Susquehanna, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and other Algonquian tribes throughout the Shenandoah Valley, they were in constant warfare with settlers in the region. Bacon's men attacked Native American settlements, but Berkeley refused to retaliate, and Bacon and his men felt that the colonial government at the hand of the king, because the king and parliament had appointed Berkeley, were not doing justice by the people, and that the House of Burgesses had become corrupt, and that they needed to rise up and burn down the settlement of Jamestown, and Bacon would now rule the colony. Okay, again, we talked about Leisler's rebellion. We talked about the Boston revolt over Andros. Those events occurred after this one. This one happened before. So what this legacy leads to, the rebellion was quashed. Bacon died of dysentery. His men are going to be tried and executed. His main leaders are going to be tried and executed. But this is the beginning of the end of indentured servitude and a movement toward African chattel slavery. Why? Any ideas? The question is, why would this event make the House of Burgesses and even Parliament move toward chattel African slavery and away from indentured servitude? This sounds like, okay, you could make it about money, but it's...
Well, the slaves don't get freed and then end up with like a sense of entitlement, I guess.
It's exactly it. That is it. Well done, Ben. It is the fact that they want, this is like, if you're looking for a plate, like people are like, how can we trace like, you know, division in race? This is a pivotal moment in divisiveness over race. Because what happens as a result of this is, let's not put Virginia in a situation where you've got white settlers with a sense of entitlement rising up against other white settlers, creating essentially a revolution. Rather, take a group of people of a different color and keep them in an institution where they can't gain freedom, pass Barbados slave codes to prevent them from having basic rights, and require that their children be born into that system as well. So this is a pivotal moment. Thank you very much. This is a pivotal moment in the story of the end of indentured servitude and the beginning of true chattel slavery in America. Here we have Nathaniel Bacon on the left and the rebellion there on the right, Bacon squaring off with William Berkeley. Colonial slavery, this is the last thing we'll talk about before we, I know I'm going a little bit over here, but I want to talk a little bit about this. This is more of a review because we've already talked about it. My apologies. So remember, slaves are kept in the Middle Passage. They're traveling along the transatlantic triangular trade route out of the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast of Africa, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. They're being captured from the interior. An estimated 20 to 22 million slaves are brought across the Atlantic. About 1 million slaves wind up in the American colonies. By the dawn of the Civil War, it's going to be 4 million in the American South. The transatlantic slave trade will be outlawed in America in 1808. We'll get down to that a bit later. Remember, the first group of Africans that arrived in Jamestown and early on in colonial Virginia and other colonies are going to be on indentures. They're not going to be owned for life. Remember that, in a lot of cases, slaves are going to outnumber white servants in colonies when they move toward chattel slavery following Bacon's rebellion. You've got more and more slaves being imported, and they are coming out of West Africa, and that is going to intensify the mercantile system, that triangular trade. The earlier slaves were not really slaves, they were on indentured, so a lot of them gained their freedom. There will ultimately become what is called maroon societies. These are runaway slaves that are going to be marooned or away from the colonial society, so to speak. Many of them will be absorbed into Native American tribes. We're going to talk about a couple of rebellions, one of which was an attempt for a maroon society. Slave codes were brought in as through Charlestown, now Charleston, via Barbados. The earliest slave codes, aka the Barbados codes, were levied to keep slaves owned for life, which would be chattel ownership for life, only freed voluntarily upon an owner, by an owner, or upon an owner's death. We'll talk about emancipation a bit later. Some of the slave codes varied from colony to colony, outlawing educating slaves, outlawed marriages, and set curfews. So here we have the colonial slave trade. This is the Middle Passage. Down below is a colonial slave auction, and then over the right, this is another advertisement, and it just basically says that these slaves have arrived from the Windward and Rice Coast. The utmost care has already been taken and shall be continued to keep them free and least danger of being infected with smallpox. No boat having been on board, meaning no one's had symptoms of smallpox, and all other communication from, or the people from Charlestown, as in Charleston, South Carolina, prevented. And this is where we're going to stop. Slave life and revolt. Slave life in the Deep South was brutal. Rice and sugar cultivation was much harder than tobacco. A lot of slaves lost their lives on those plantations. Many Africans in America blended their own languages with English, Spanish, and French. A lot of Men and women were sold, mostly men though. They made major contributions to folk stories, music, instruments like the banjo and bongo are brought in from African culture. Also, African folk, African tales are blended into the American culture as well. African slaves also come over as skilled artisans, carpenters, bricklayers, tanners. You're familiar with what a tanner is, a leather maker. One example is Black Ned Tarr of Augusta County, Virginia. He's a free African American who was actually one of the most respected members of the community in Augusta County. One of my professors from VMI, Colonel McCluskey, published a book on Black Ned Tarr several years back. It's an incredible study on free African American in the American South. Another impressive thing about that era too, Ned Tarr actually took a white wife, and the community didn't stop him. That was actually illegal in the slave codes. Obviously, most of the work was backbreaking in fields, cleaning swamps, grubbing out trees. Slaves were treated poorly all throughout the colonies. There are two major slave revolts, and I want you all to take note of these. One is the New York City slave revolt that occurred over the passage of slave codes in 1712. Dozens of whites were killed, 21 slaves were executed. The largest colonial slave revolt was in 1739 at the Wilson and Stono Creek. Anybody been down to Charleston on vacation or visited? Has anybody been out to Folly Beach? Okay, you've passed through where Wallace and the Stono run. This was a rebellion by a slave to lead a group of slaves to Spanish Florida to establish a maroon society. Just under 100 people were killed on both sides as a result of this rebellion. There will be a larger rebellion that we'll learn about later in the new nation, and that's going to be the Nat Turner Rebellion. Has anybody ever heard of that? Occurred in 1831. We'll teach you about that. So the Stono Rebellion occurred in Charleston, South Carolina. And just keep in mind that the development of this agricultural-based society and a slave-based economy that keeps the American South in a perpetual system of mercantilism is going to lead to the American Civil War. To say that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery is ludicrous. Okay? It had nearly everything to do with slavery. Yeah, not every person fighting in the American Civil War was fighting to protect slavery or fighting against slavery, but the root issue politically had to do with that very cause. So what I've provided for you guys here is one of the, I don't know about you guys, I'm into like historical markers, it's weird, but I like to pull some historical markers for you guys from time to time. So if you're ever back down in Charleston or in visiting, and if you've never visited Charleston, it's a city that you should check out. So it's really worth your time. It's a beautiful city, a lot of great history, just awesome restaurants, beautiful beaches, great fishing. It's a paradise. The Stono Rebellion is where that occurred, so you might want to check that out at some point. And this is just a little description of what occurred in 1739 down there in Charleston.